It is June 12th, 2024, and Biden is headed to Italy for a meeting with G7 leaders. And although this comes just days after these leaders got together for the commemoration of D Day, it is especially notable given that it comes days after the EU parliamentary elections, which spelled a major defeat for leaders like German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and French President Emmanuel Macron. In fact, it seems to be almost a meeting of the losers circle when you throw in Rishi Sunak and the elections that he's preparing for, not very well, I would add, over in the UK. And then you, of course, have Joe Biden, who has had just one moment after another recently that the White House has had to come out and to explain for. It's not exactly the strongest showing of G7 leaders that we've ever had, but maybe it's the one that we deserve, right? When you look at the West, everything that they're doing and the fact that Biden's focus is still on Russia and China and Russia and China, and it is a never ending spiral, it feels like. We discussed all of that, the latest tensions, where things stand, and where we are going from here earlier with a special guest. So let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is George Szamuely, a senior research fellow at the Global Policy Institute. George, thanks so much for taking the time to join me today.
It's always a pleasure, Rachel.
It's always great to have you on the show. Now, I want to get your take on the latest here, as I know that Biden is headed to Italy today for a meeting of the G7 leaders. Now, seems like these leaders were just together a few days ago in Normandy celebrating, or rather commemorating D Day, and yet now they're back together again, so they're flying back and forth. But this time around, it comes after those EU parliamentary elections over the weekend. So it's not exactly the winner's circle, especially when you take into account Emmanuel Macron and Olaf Scholz, who both had major defeats. How do you view this latest meeting of G7 leaders?
Well, as you put it very well, it's another meeting, and that's what these people are always doing. If you're not at the G7, you're at the NATO summit, and there's a NATO summit that's coming up next month. If you're not at the NATO summit, you're at the G20. There's always some powwow involving these big leaders who are doing big, important issues. Um, and as you say, almost all of them are absolutely very, very unpopular. The only one who actually did reasonably well in the European parliamentary elections is the host, Giorgia Meloni. And it's not so much that she did well, it's just that her political allies on the right did very poorly. So she basically just held her own. But in comparison with the performance of Emmanuel Macron, which was truly an embarrassment, he got 14% of the vote. He gets beaten by the National Rally, which, up until yesterday had been anathema to all right-thinking Frenchmen. Well, we can't possibly have anything to do with Marine Le Pen, and of course her father, who is the founder of the party, Jean-Marie Le Pen. So he's been absolutely humiliated. He's going to hold elections at the end of the month, and of course Olaf Scholz, whose coalition has been absolutely decimated in that election. I mean, it's an amazing unpopularity that's in display. Now, Scholz, unlike Macron, has vowed that he doesn't intend to resign. He's going to serve out his term until next year. Well, we'll see if that happens, because his coalition is so unpopular. Because if you look at the total percentage of the vote that they won, the three parties, the Social Democrats, the Greens, and the Free Democrats, that still was less than the Christian Democrats, which is the main opposition party. So if in September, when they have provincial elections, and it's quite likely that the Alternative für Deutschland party, the party of the so-called far right, if they do very well in those elections, I think the pressure is going to be insurmountable for Scholz to stand down and call for elections.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see just how quickly it feels like all of the building blocks have just toppled, right? Even with just what we're seeing in France, as you were pointing out there, with Macron saying, okay, he's calling snap elections. It seems as though he thinks that, his country is going to stand behind him, but you've got Marine Le Pen chomping at the bit. She is ready to go, ready to take over. Do you think that Macron is a little bit overconfident here? And does that also explain all of his latest rhetoric about Ukraine, where he's ready for NATO boots to be on the ground? Well, the public's not exactly there with him.
That's true. It's very hard to get into Macron's mind. It may be that he is calculating, as you suggest, that if the French will say, okay, we can vote in the European parliamentary election. That's a protest vote. We can express our disgust with the government and vote, for the national rally. And no one was expecting, a national assembly elections immediately following. But now that they have these parliamentary elections, are the French really going to entrust governance to the national rally, who really have no governmental experience at all? I mean, they really have never been in government. So are they really going to vote like that? Well, maybe they will, maybe they won't. I mean, we don't know. And therefore, I'm also wondering whether Macron's calculation, either the French are not going to do it, they're not going to really risk handing power to Le Pen, or, and here I worry very much, Macron is thinking about war in Ukraine against Russia, and he wants basically Le Pen's national rally to take responsibility for it. They're the ones who've been kind of hemming and hawing. Well, we don't really want to do this. We don't want sanctions. We've got to think about French national interest. On the other hand, we support Ukraine. I mean, they've been all over the place. So it's possible that Macron is thinking, hey, I'm going to go ahead, do this thing, because he seems to be completely fanatical now on Ukraine. And then because he's basically responsible for foreign policy, and the presidential system is foreign policy is entirely his domain. So he basically is going to stick the Le Pen's government, if Le Pen does well in the legislative elections, Le Pen's government with the responsibility for this war. I don't know. I mean, he may well be thinking rather cynically along those lines.
That is an interesting point. I have not heard that one yet, or really even taken that into account, because I'm with you. When I hear from Marine Le Pen, I don't get the feeling that she is completely 100%, standing on her policies, right? It's, oh, we'll send defensive weapons to Ukraine. Okay, we just don't want those weapons to be used on Russian territory. It's like, that's a slippery slope that many NATO leaders have gone down, as we've seen. So many of them started out 2.5 years ago saying, oh, it's all about Ukraine just defending itself. And then they've made their way to, okay, yeah, sure, we're fine with our weapons that we send being used on what we recognize as Russian territory. And when you have that shift that we're kind of seeing in the EU, it feels like there is this rightward shift. What do you attribute that to? Is it a number of different policies that have kind of come into play? Is it this green agenda, or is there more to it?
Well, I think there are a number of issues. I mean, obviously, immigration has been absolutely number one issue throughout Europe for many years. I mean, it came to a head in 2015, and we're still living with the consequences of what Angela Merkel did in 2015. I mean, which just shook up the European system. It led to Brexit and the real rise of the right in France, in Italy, in Germany. So I think immigration is a huge issue. There's also, as you said, the green agenda, deeply unpopular, and that's been unpopular for a long time because it's anti-fossil fuel, and it's hitting ordinary people, because it's ordinary people who use fossil fuels all the time, particularly truckers, farmers, and anybody who has to drive to work. They don't want to pay for a lot more for their fuel. And if you remember, there was the yellow vest movement which was very powerful. It went on. Remember, every week there was these massive demonstrations against Macron, and it was about the fuel prices, because there were people were really suffering, and that was entirely due to this environmental agenda pushed by the EU, the green agenda that came with starting in 2019. And Macron used the police in a very brutal way. If you recall, people lost their eyes because the police used rubber bullets. And then imperceptibly, that segued into the repressions that followed, the COVID restrictions. And the lockdowns in France were among the strictest. Macron is a real little authoritarian. Kind of so he really likes using the police to crack down on protesters, on dissent. So, and that was throughout Europe. I mean, there's been the reaction against the authoritarianism that was on display in COVID, and in particular, and people are gradually realizing what a scam COVID was. I mean, this was a total hoax, and in the name of a hoax, people, had obviously had their freedoms taken away from them, but a lot of businesses, just disappeared as a result of the lockdown. So I think there's a reaction against the people who are responsible for COVID, and they're the ones who got punished. Macron, Scholz were punished, and that's why Meloni, who came on the scene a little bit later, she didn't win. She didn't come to power, I think, till about September, October 2022. So she didn't get hit with COVID in the way that Macron and Scholz, and in the way that the Tories are going to be smashed in the UK. Of course, the UK is not in the EU anymore, but there are going to be elections, really now in a couple of weeks. And the Tories, who presided over COVID, also presided over net zero emissions and everything else, are going to be absolutely slaughtered, could simply be wiped off the face of the earth as a result of that election.
Yeah, that's an interesting point too, and I think sometimes we forget that COVID was just a few years ago, right? It seems like forever ago at this point with everything that has happened over the last couple of years. But when it comes down to where Germany stands in all of this, I'm also curious because, Olaf Scholz has not been popular, to put it lightly. In addition to Scholz not being popular, you also have this massive crackdown in Germany on the AfD, and this really push to say, oh, the Alternative for Germany party is racist, right? They are the ones who we need to stay away from. And yet they did better than Scholz's own party in that parliamentary election. So what is the message that sends to you when that is how the public is responding, even with that crackdown?
Well, you put that very well, because there was an enormous onslaught by the government, by the security apparatus of Germany, by the media, by business interests, to crush the Alternative for Deutschland. And here we had court rulings saying that it was perfectly legitimate for the security services of Germany to monitor the activities and the leaders of the AfD. In other words, it's perfectly reasonable for them to wiretap their phones, spy on their meetings and so on. Okay, well, that was fine. And I actually thought that this massive onslaught by the state would succeed. I thought that they would just do very badly. I thought, they were in the mid-20s a few months ago. I thought, they're now sinking like a stone in the polls. Probably they're going to end up with single digits. And I was wrong. I'm happy I was wrong, because I think it's outrageous that, the security services somehow have the right to spy on and instigate violence against a political party, against elected representatives. But I think it's very significant by the fact that they managed to get to 16%, despite this onslaught. And as you say, pushing the Social Democrats into third place, then that means they've managed to survive, and that means that they do have a political future ahead of them. Also, there are going to be elections in September. And they're expected to do very well because when you have the elections in the East and what used to be the former East Germany, that's really their base. That's where they're very strong. So they're likely to do rather well in these elections in September because they're going to take place in the former East Germany, which itself is very interesting because that you had this unification of Germany 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago now. And in the end, it seems like you still got two Germanys. In the West, the AfD has very little presence, but in the East, they're rapidly becoming the number one party there. So it's interesting. Whatever happened to that reunification of Germany?
Yeah, no kidding. And it is interesting to see how it is kind of implementing itself in 2024. Now, bringing it back to this G7 leaders meeting that we are also keeping an eye on in the aftermath of those elections. And I would love to be a fly on the wall to hear some of those discussions because I'm sure you have Macron and Scholz and Biden too, right? Saying, oh man, it's going to be okay. You're going to get through this, or maybe some variation of that. But when it comes to what Biden is looking for in this meeting, you've got reports saying that his goal is to increase pressure on Russia and on China for its support of Moscow. How do you view that? I guess effort on Biden's end. And obviously he's going to be there with a bunch of like-minded leaders, so it's not like you're going to get much pushback against what Biden is likely to say about Russia and China. But how do you view that as being the focus of this meeting?
Well, obviously going to be a big thing. I mean, what else is there to talk about other than, as you say, commiserations? And in the case of Biden, they say, hey, you're at record lows in the opinion polls. No president seeking re-election has ever been in the doldrums as you are in. But what else is there to talk about other than Russia? And I'm sure they're going to advocate more sanctions. This time they're going to try and hit the secondary sanctions. In other words, the banks that are doing business, international banks, not Russian banks, international banks that are doing business with sanctioned Russian entities. Just about every entity in Russia is now sanctioned. So you have banks in China that they might be hit with sanctions, of banks in Kazakhstan and so on. So that they're obviously going to propose something along those lines. But then they're going to come and address the issue, I think, that we talked about a few weeks ago, which is, well, what about these frozen assets? Now, the EU came up with this mealy mouth solution. Well, we have these profits. The profits they earn on these assets. Maybe we can give that to Ukraine, but we'll still keep the principal. So that it's just the profits we're going to give to Ukraine. Because if we give the principal, then that is theft, and no one's going to want to leave their money in our banks if they think we're going to steal it. But the Americans, they're going to push and push and push. They say, no, you got to give everything. No. That's like, you don't have to give the whole 300 billion right now, but you got to give a big chunk of it right now. Maybe 50 billion or whatever. So they're going to argue about that. But the way these things go, the Americans invariably get their own way. I mean, they're all so wedded now to this policy that they can't really resist the Americans. I mean, just coming up with this little formula. Well, it's just only the profits, which is profits to Ukraine, not the principal. And the Americans is going, no, you've got to give the whole thing because that's a lot of money, and we got to give every single penny we've got to Ukraine. So I'm expecting a lot of pressure to come from the Americans, and I'm expecting the Americans to prevail in the end.
Yeah, it's interesting. Biden has, well, not necessarily Biden himself, but let's say that his team has come up with this new plan where they say, okay, you want to give the interest from this, around $300 billion, or at least the portion of it that's in the EU. We'll take the interest and we'll use it as collateral to try to get a $50 billion loan for Ukraine. So that's, we sit here and we go, well, that's not much money. Okay, $50 billion, a little bit more money. But when it comes down to it, I mean, it's still really not that much money for what Ukraine actually needs, even if they're able to succeed and to get this loan. Do you view it having really making much of a difference at all for Ukraine?
Well, yeah, I don't think it'll make a difference in the sense that Ukraine cannot win this war, but I don't think the NATO powers and the United States ever envisage that Ukraine can win this war. I mean, what they want to do is to keep this war going. I mean, that's really the goal, is keep this war going. And Zelensky has pretty much told Biden, he's told the Europeans, I will keep this war going, but you've got to keep giving me money. Just keep pouring money down our gullet so that we can keep making, whatever money we're making, skimming off the top, buying houses. Yeah, but you've got to keep it going. Because if you don't, then we might do. We might go and talk to Putin. We might strike a deal and say, we can't possibly accept you having a deal. No. We'll find some more money for you. So that's the way Zelensky is thinking, which is, hey, we know what they want. They want to keep this war going, and I'm willing to go along with it. But you've got to keep coming up with money. And so that's why that's the interest of NATO, the Americans, which is, well, let's keep it going for longer and longer, and let's keep bleeding Russia, exhausting Russia. What's the end game? I guess the end game is they think at some point, there's going to be some turmoil in Russia. Russia will fold. Either Russia will capitulate or Russia will collapse. There'll be a coup or whatever. That's their calculation. But they're not thinking in terms of military victory. They can't. I mean, Ukraine cannot achieve a military victory. So the goal is keep the war going in the hope that Russia will implode at some point.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see how long they continue on towards that goal, I guess, for as long as they can continue to keep Kiev on a lifeline and they can keep the money going, certainly.
Because they keep coming up, they're finding money somewhere. They got that 61 billion. I mean, they came up with a 61 billion. Well, they're going to have to come up with some more money pretty soon. I mean, that trough, needs to be kept filled. So, 61 billion, that doesn't go a long way. So they're coming up, okay, we'll come up with another 50 billion here. But pretty soon, Washington is going to be on the hook for an additional 50, 60, 100 billion. Who knows?
Yeah, it is a vicious cycle that, well, the US, the EU, the UK, that they have all gotten themselves into. Certainly a lot at stake here all around. And I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break down all of the latest here. George Szamuely, a senior research fellow at the Global Policy Institute. Thank you so much for your time and insight.
It was a pleasure, Rachel.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment, and as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. If you want to support my work, you can also check out my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/rachelblevins. That's where you can sign up as a monthly paid subscriber and join the community there. As always, thank y'all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.